Hello, are you ready for today's story?
The news should have brought him joy. Instead, it brought rage. Beatrice stood in Julian's private library at Ashworth Manor, her hands trembling slightly as she held the letter from her physician. The Cotswolds estate spread out behind the tall windows, rolling green hills, ancient stone walls, the visible evidence of the Ashworth legacy. Inside, the library was lined with leather-bound books and dark wood, a space that had always felt safe, until now. "I'm pregnant," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder and joy. "Julian, we're going to have a child. After all this time, the doctor confirmed it just this morning. We're going to have our heir." She'd expected him to pull her into his arms. She'd expected tears of happiness. She'd expected the man who'd courted her so passionately 3 years ago to return, the man who'd promised her a lifetime of devotion. Instead, his face went white, then red. "Impossible," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That's impossible. Julian, the doctor, you're lying," he roared, his voice echoing through the library. "You're a liar, Beatrice." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What? No, You cannot be pregnant," he continued, his face contorted with rage and something else, something that looked like terror. "It's impossible. I am not capable of fathering children. I was told by the finest physician in England that I am incapable, completely incapable." Beatrice felt the colour drain from her face. "What are you talking about? Julian, what do you mean?" "Don't stand there and lie to me," he roared. He grabbed a crystal decanter from his desk, expensive, heavy, filled with brandy, and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the wall near her head, glass shattering, the sharp sound of destruction filling the space. Beatrice gasped, flinching away, her hands instinctively moving to protect her belly. Their child, their impossible child. "The baby is his," Julian continued, his voice breaking with something that sounded like anguish beneath the rage. "You've betrayed me with another man. You've made a mockery of this marriage. You're carrying another man's heir. And you have the audacity to stand here and lie to my face." The library that had felt safe moments ago now felt like a trap, and Beatrice understood. Her husband had just revealed something devastating, and he believed she was the liar. Stay until the end, because this story will show you what happens when a wife must carry her child, while her own husband questions her honor, and the impossible journey to proving the truth. Where are you listening from? I'd love to know. But to understand how they arrived at this devastating moment, we have to go back. 3 years earlier, Beatrice had married Julian Ashworth believing she'd found paradise. The wedding had been one of the great events of the season, held at a small church near Ashworth Manor, attended by the most prominent families in the Cotswolds and London. Her family, the Westcotts, had been allies of the Ashworths for generations. The marriage was both love match and dynastic necessity, and miraculously, it was both. Julian had been devoted from the start. He'd courted her with genuine attention, looking at her as though she was the only person in the world who mattered. He'd promised her a life of partnership and passion, and for the first 3 years, he'd kept that promise. They'd settled into Ashworth Manor, a sprawling Georgian estate with gardens that stretched for miles across the Cotswolds landscape. Julian managed the estate with intelligence and care. Beatrice had thrown herself into the role of countess-in-waiting, overseeing the household, supporting local charities, preparing for the day when they would inherit the earldom and assume full responsibility for the family legacy. Their greatest joy was their marriage itself. Julian would come to her bed with genuine affection. He would hold her close in the morning light and tell her how much he loved her. They'd made plans for children, for a family that would cement the Ashworth line. And then, 6 months ago, everything had changed. Julian had been fox hunting, a favourite sport, something he did with the other gentlemen of the county every season. He was an excellent horseman, confident and skilled. Beatrice had waved goodbye from the manor steps, expecting him to return by evening, flushed with the excitement of the hunt. Instead, he'd returned on a stretcher, thrown from his horse when the animal had spooked at a stream crossing. His external injuries had been minor, cuts and bruises that would heal within weeks. But the fever had come next. It had started as a slight elevation in temperature, nothing alarming, but it had grown. By the 3rd day, Julian was burning with a fever so high that he became delirious. The family physician, Dr. Albright, had been summoned from the village. He'd examined Julian carefully, documenting the high temperature, the sweating, the weakness that seemed to consume him. Post-traumatic fever, Dr. Albright had declared, not uncommon after significant physical shock to the system. The body's response to injury. He should recover with rest and careful nursing. But Julian hadn't recovered quickly. The fever had lingered for weeks. It would break, then return. His body had become weak and wasted. Beatrice had nursed him herself, despite the servants' offers, sitting beside his bed day and night, cooling his forehead with damp cloths, coaxing him to drink broth and water. Slowly, gradually, the fever subsided. By the end of 4 weeks, Julian had been able to sit up in bed. By 6 weeks, he'd been able to walk to the window. By 2 months, the physical recovery had been complete. But something else had changed in him. He'd become distant. The warmth that had defined their relationship had cooled. He'd stopped coming to her bed. He'd stopped looking at her with that open affection that had characterized their early marriage. Instead, he'd thrown himself into the estate management, spending long hours in his study, avoiding her company. Beatrice had assumed it was the lingering effects of the fever, that his strength was still recovering, that he needed time to return to himself. She'd given him space, waited patiently for the man she loved to return from whatever internal place he'd withdrawn to, but he hadn't returned. Instead, he'd become increasingly cold, not cruel, but distant in a way that was almost worse. She would try to engage him in conversation, and he would respond with single words. She would try to sit near him in the evening, and he would find an excuse to leave the room. The passion that had defined their marriage had been replaced by a careful the kind reserved for acquaintances, not wives. She'd begun to wonder if he'd fallen out of love with her, if the fever had changed something fundamental in how he felt, if the brightness of their early marriage was something that couldn't survive the reality of married life. She hadn't known the truth, that he was protecting a secret so devastating that he couldn't bear to face her with it. She hadn't known that Dr. Albright had called him to his study 2 weeks after the fever had broken, and had delivered news that had destroyed Julian's sense of himself as a man. The fever was severe, the doctor had said carefully. Prolonged, high grade, affecting your entire system. Such fevers can cause damage to various systems of the body. In my medical opinion, the damage in your case is complete and unalterable. Julian had understood immediately. The doctor was speaking in careful language, but the meaning was unmistakable. He was infertile. The fever had destroyed his ability to father children. He was no longer a man in the way that mattered to his family, his legacy, his entire reason for existing. After receiving Dr. Albright's diagnosis, Julian had become a ghost in his own marriage. He'd performed the duties of a husband. He provided for Beatrice financially. He included her in public engagements where necessary. He maintained the appearance of a functioning marriage. But privately, he'd retreated into a prison of his own making. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been granted a wife he loved, a marriage that had been both passion and purpose, and the fever had stolen his ability to complete it. He couldn't give Beatrice children. He couldn't give the Ashworth family an heir. He couldn't fulfill the singular purpose his birth had ordained, to continue the line. He was a failure, a man in appearance only, stripped of the essential capacity that defined manhood in their world. Rather than tell Beatrice the truth and risk seeing pity in her eyes, or worse, contempt, he'd simply withdrawn. He'd made excuses. He'd claimed fatigue. He'd spent his evenings in his study rather than in her company. He'd turned away from her in the darkness, claiming exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with the weight of his secret. Beatrice had borne his withdrawal with the quiet patience that defined her character. She'd continued to manage the household beautifully. She'd continued to be gracious at social functions. She'd continued to love him, even as he pushed her away. But the warmth had drained from their marriage, replaced by an icy formality. Beatrice had begun to suspect that perhaps he'd realized he'd made a mistake in marrying her. Perhaps the fever had changed his feelings. Perhaps he was waiting for an opportunity to distance himself further. The questions had become a constant refrain in her mind. What have I done? Have I failed him? Did I cause this somehow? She'd taken to spending time alone in the gardens, walking the pathways that Julian had once walked with her, remembering the man he'd been before the accident. She'd prayed in the small chapel on the estate, asking God for understanding, for patience, for the strength to bear her husband's inexplicable distance. Julian had watched her withdraw into herself and the guilt had compounded his misery. He was hurting her with his silence. He was destroying the marriage he valued above all else, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. The shame was too deep. The failure was too complete. 6 months had passed in this agonized silence, and then everything had changed again. Beatrice had begun to feel unwell in the mornings, a slight nausea that came and went, a tiredness that seemed disproportionate to her activities. She'd dismissed it as the physical manifestation of the emotional distance in her marriage, the body's way of expressing what the heart couldn't speak. But then her courses had stopped. She'd counted the days carefully, confirming what her body was telling her, and she'd gone to Dr. Albright, expecting perhaps to be told that her emotional distress was affecting her health, that she needed rest, that she should take a tonic. Instead, the doctor had confirmed what seemed impossible. She was pregnant. 4 months along, I would estimate, Dr. Albright had said, his elderly face creased with satisfaction. Congratulations, Lady Beatrice. You've accomplished what many couples struggle to achieve. The Ashworth heir is on the way. Beatrice had walked back to the manor in a state of stunned joy. All the distance, all the coldness. Perhaps it had been for nothing. Perhaps Julian had simply needed time to recover from the fever. Perhaps the distance between them would vanish the moment she told him they were expecting. She'd imagined his face lighting with joy. She'd imagined him pulling her close, the warmth returning to his eyes, the passion rekindling between them. She'd imagined that their marriage would be restored not just by love, but by the certainty of an heir. She'd gone to his study in the late afternoon, her heart racing with anticipation. She'd had no idea that her news would trigger the very thing she'd been dreading, the complete and utter destruction of everything she believed their marriage to be. After Julian threw the decanter and called her a liar, Beatrice had stood alone in his study, glass crunching beneath her feet, her heart shattered into pieces. She'd left without another word. She'd simply turned and walked out, her hand protective over her belly, her mind spinning with confusion and pain. She'd gone to her chambers and locked the door, wanting to scream, wanting to understand, unable to do either. Julian had not come to find her. Instead, he'd spent the evening in his study, consuming brandy and wrestling with the magnitude of his error. The doctor had told him the damage was complete, but Beatrice was pregnant. The logic that had seemed so absolute now seemed flawed. Perhaps Dr. Albright had been wrong. Perhaps the newer medical understanding suggested possibilities the older physician hadn't considered. Or perhaps Beatrice truly had betrayed him. The thought made him ill, not with anger anymore, but with a nauseating uncertainty. Because if she had betrayed him, if the child was not his, then the scandal would be catastrophic. For her family, for the Ashworth name. He couldn't allow anyone to know. The shame would be complete, but it was already too late. His cousin, Mr. Alistair Finch, had been visiting when Beatrice made her announcement. He'd been in the drawing room with Julian's mother when Beatrice had swept through, her face radiant, clearly searching for Julian, and he'd overheard, just enough, to understand that something momentous had happened. Alistair Finch was a man of moderate means and considerable ambition. As Julian's cousin, he was third in line to the earldom, a position that would never yield him anything unless both Julian and Julian's younger brother died without heir. But if Julian's marriage to Beatrice ended in scandal, if no legitimate heir was produced, then Alistair's position might improve dramatically. Within 2 days, rumours had begun to circulate among the county families. Whispers, careful, concerned whispers about the Marchioness, speculation about her frequent indispositions, questions about whether the marriage was truly happy, insinuations that perhaps the Marquess had remained distant from her chambers for a reason. Alistair had been careful in how he spread the rumours. He'd consulted with sympathetic family friends, expressing his deep concern for Julian's well-being. He'd suggested, delicately, that perhaps Julian had confided in him about certain medical impossibilities, that perhaps the Marquess had reasons to doubt that any child claiming to be his could truly be legitimate. The rumours had grown tentacles. They'd spread through the Cotswolds drawing rooms and into London society. By the end of a week, half of England was whispering about the Marquess and Marchioness of Ashworth and the scandal that was supposedly about to erupt. Beatrice had hidden herself away in her chambers, unable to face the sudden shift in society's attitude toward her. Invitations had begun to be withdrawn. Social calls had stopped. The women who'd been her friends had begun to treat her with careful distance, their eyes filled with speculation and judgment. And then Alistair had come to her. He'd found her in the morning room, sitting alone, her hands folded over her belly as though she could protect her child through sheer will. "Lady Beatrice," he'd said, his voice dripping with false concern, "I hope you'll forgive my intrusion, but I felt it my duty to speak with you directly. The rumours, I'm afraid, are becoming quite damaging to your reputation, to your family's standing, to the Ashworth name." Beatrice had looked at him with tired eyes. "What do you want, Mr. Finch?" "I want to help," he'd said, settling himself into a chair without being invited. "I've taken the liberty of making inquiries about a rest cure, a facility in Switzerland, very discreet, very prestigious. I believe a few months away from the scrutiny and judgment of society, would do you tremendous good. You could rest, recover, and when you return, the rumours will have faded. Society has such a short memory, particularly if the situation resolves itself quietly." Beatrice had understood immediately what he was suggesting. Disappear. Have the baby in secret. Return without the child. Let the scandal fade, because there would be no proof of anything. "I'm not leaving," she'd said quietly. "This is my home. This is my husband's child. I won't hide." Alistair's mask of concern had slipped slightly. "I'm afraid you don't understand the gravity of the situation. The Marquis himself has made it clear that he doubts the paternity of this child. If you insist on remaining, on carrying this pregnancy to term publicly, you will be branded as a woman of loose morals. Your family will suffer. Your child will be born under a cloud of scandal that may never lift. Then my husband needs to stand beside me," Beatrice had said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Not run from the truth, not hide, but face it." Alistair had left her then, disappointed that she wasn't cooperating with his plan. But the damage was already done. The rumours were already spreading, and Julian, consumed by doubt and shame and the terror of what his family would think, had done nothing to stop them. Weeks passed, and Beatrice's pregnancy became increasingly visible. She could no longer hide it beneath loose gowns, her belly rounded with undeniable evidence of her condition. She wore her pregnancy like a badge of honour, or defiance, depending on who was looking. Julian had not spoken to her since the library. They existed in the same house as strangers. He'd moved his things to a separate chamber. He'd taken his meals in his study. When they encountered each other in the halls or drawing rooms, he looked through her as though she was transparent. The worst part was the uncertainty in his eyes. She could see that he was warring with himself. That part of him wanted to believe her, and part of him had constructed an elaborate narrative of betrayal. She could see the agony he was experiencing, but she couldn't reach him. Her words of truth bounced off the walls he'd built around himself. She'd sent him letters, begging him to listen, to believe her, to trust in what they'd shared. She'd poured her heart onto paper, asserting that the child was his, that she'd been faithful, that the distance in their marriage had been his doing, but that she loved him still, and she wanted their child to have a father who believed in him. He'd never responded. Society had turned its back on her. The women who'd been her friend had stopped calling. Invitations were withdrawn. Even her own family, uncertain of her version of events, had become distant. She'd received a letter from her mother expressing concern and suggesting that perhaps Beatrice should consider a separation until matters could be clarified. Beatrice had borne it all with a quiet strength that was perhaps the most admirable thing about her. She'd continued to walk the gardens, her hand on her belly, talking to her unborn child. She'd continued to attend church, despite the stares and whispers. She'd continued to believe that the truth would eventually prevail, that the child would be born, and that his or her features would tell the story that words could not. She'd also begun to wonder if perhaps Julian would never believe her, if this accusation would be the thing that ended their marriage, if the man she loved had been destroyed by the fever as surely as his body had nearly been. Julian, meanwhile, was being consumed by the poison of his own doubt. He'd cycled through rage, despair, and a terrible, aching uncertainty. Some days he was convinced of Beatrice's infidelity. Some days he was tormented by the possibility that he'd destroyed an innocent woman's life and reputation based on a doctor's outdated medical opinion. He'd begun to feel physically ill. The weight of his actions, his accusations, His silence, his failure to defend her against the rumors, was crushing him. And then, 3 months into Beatrice's pregnancy, something shifted in him. He'd been in his study, reading, or rather, staring at a book without seeing the words, when a thought occurred to him with the force of revelation. If Dr. Albright's diagnosis was as absolute as the man had claimed, then how was Beatrice pregnant at all? He'd sat up, the book falling from his hands. The question spiraled. What if infertility from fever wasn't as complete and unalterable as the doctor had suggested? What if his shame had been based on an incomplete diagnosis? What if Beatrice had been telling the truth all along? The magnitude of the possibility that he'd destroyed his wife's reputation, her social standing, her mental and emotional well-being, based on a lie he'd believed, had sent him to his knees. He'd needed answers, and he'd needed them from someone other than the village physician who'd given him the devastating diagnosis in the first place. That evening, he'd made a decision. He would travel to London. He would consult with an eminent specialist, the finest physician money could procure, and he would get an answer to a question that would either confirm his worst fears or reveal the magnitude of his error. Edmund Hargrove was the most renowned physician in London, a man who'd studied at the finest medical institutions in Europe and who kept abreast of the latest medical advances. Julian had presented his case to the man in careful terms, without revealing the personal devastation that hung on the answer. He'd described the fever, its severity, its duration. He'd mentioned Dr. Albright's diagnosis. Dr. Hargrove had listened carefully, asking precise questions about the fever's progression, the symptoms, and the recovery. And then, he'd said something that had stopped Julian's heart. Post-traumatic fever, of the severity you describe, does sometimes result in temporary infertility. However, the word temporary is crucial. The condition is rarely permanent, and it is certainly never absolute. I would estimate that 70 to 80% of men who experience such fevers do recover their fertility within a year or two. The remaining 20 to 30% may experience prolonged infertility, but even in those cases, recovery is possible, if improbable. There is no medical condition that renders it impossible for a man to father children, only extraordinarily improbable. Julian had felt the floor tilt beneath him. Dr. Albright, he'd said carefully, seemed quite certain of his diagnosis. Dr. Albright is a competent country physician, Dr. Hargrove had said without judgment. But his knowledge is of the old school. The new medical understanding, based on more careful observation and study, suggests that the human body is far more capable of recovery than we once believed. Your fever damage, if it occurred at all, would most likely be temporary. If you fathered a child within the first year after your illness, I would have no doubt that the child was genuinely yours. Julian had left that office in a state of profound shock. He'd gotten a child from Beatrice. Beatrice was pregnant with his child. The timing was exactly right. Within 6 months of his illness, well within the window of possible recovery. Beatrice had been telling the truth, and he'd called her a liar. He'd accused her of infidelity. He'd destroyed her reputation. He'd made her endure weeks of social ostracism, family rejection, and public scandal, and all of it had been based on his shame, his fear, his unwillingness to face the possibility that he'd been wrong. He'd raced back to the manor as if the very speed of his journey could undo the damage he'd caused. Julian had arrived at Ashworth Manor in the late evening, his clothes dust-stained from fast travel, his face bearing the weight of the journey and the enormity of what he needed to do. He'd found Alistair in the drawing room, nursing a brandy with the satisfied expression of a man who believed things were proceeding according to his plan. "You," Julian had said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Alistair had looked up, startled. "You've been spreading rumours about your cousin's wife," Julian had continued, moving toward him with the controlled fury of a man who understood power and how to wield it. "You've been suggesting, with great care and false concern, that my wife has been unfaithful. You've been attempting to manipulate her into disappearing, into abandoning her own child, and you've done this because you believed it would improve your position in this family." Alistair had begun to sputter. "I was merely concerned." "Silence," Julian had said. "You are no longer welcome at Ashworth Manor. You will leave in the morning, and you will never return. If I hear even a whisper of the rumours continuing, if I learn that you've spoken my wife's name in anything other than complete respect, I will destroy you socially and financially. Do you understand me? Alistair had understood. He'd left the manor the next morning, and he'd been completely ostracised from county society by the end of the week. But the public damage had already been done. Beatrice's reputation was in tatters. Society had already begun to construct its narrative. Julian had known what he needed to do. He'd gone to Beatrice's chambers, his heart breaking at the sight of her, thinner than she should be, her beautiful face worn with grief, her hand protective over her belly even as she slept. He'd sat beside her and waited for her to wake. When her eyes had opened, she'd looked at him with the wariness of someone who'd been hurt too deeply to hope. "I'm sorry," he'd said immediately, the words inadequate and yet necessary. "I'm so sorry, Beatrice. I was wrong. You were telling the truth. The doctor who examined me in the summer, he was wrong. His diagnosis was incomplete. The medical specialists in London have confirmed that temporary infertility from fever is rare but recoverable. I fathered this child. Your child is mine, and I have caused you immeasurable harm based on my cowardice and my shame." Tears had streamed down his face as he'd continued. "I was afraid that I was failing you as a husband, afraid that I couldn't give you what you needed. And instead of facing that fear like a man, I buried it in shame and made you carry the burden of my self-pity. You are the strongest person I know, and I have treated you abominably." Beatrice had listened without speaking. And then, in the moment when Julian had thought she might turn him away forever, she'd reached out and taken his hand. "I never stopped loving you," she'd whispered. "Even when I hated what you were doing, even when I questioned whether our marriage could survive, some part of me understood that you were suffering, that you were trapped by something I couldn't see. I don't deserve your forgiveness," Julian had said. "No, but I'm giving it to you anyway, because I love you, and because our child deserves a father who's learned to be brave." The next morning, Julian had met with both families. He'd gathered the Ashworths and the Westcotts in the drawing room at Ashworth Manor, and he'd presented the truth with the authority of a man who'd had his entire foundation shaken and rebuilt. "The rumours circulating about my wife are false," he'd declared. "I am responsible for them. I misspoke in a moment of private anguish, and those private words were seized upon by someone with ulterior motives and spread throughout society. I am here to correct the record, publicly and absolutely. My wife is not only innocent of any wrongdoing, she is the most honourable woman I know. The child she carries is mine. Our marriage is intact, and any person who suggests otherwise will answer me." He'd presented the letters from the London specialists confirming the medical details. He'd made clear that the rumours had been a family matter, now resolved. The Westcotts had embraced their daughter, shamefaced at having doubted her. Julian's mother had wept and begged Beatrice's forgiveness for allowing the rumours to take root. The social machinery that had turned against Beatrice had begun, slowly, to reverse. Within a week, the invitations had started to arrive again. The women who'd shunned her began to call, their faces creased with embarrassment at having believed the rumours. Society, which had been so quick to condemn, was equally quick to rehabilitate. Beatrice had borne it all with quiet dignity, neither triumphant nor bitter. She'd accepted the apologies without rancour, and the reintegration into society with grace. And through it all, she'd allowed Julian to be present for her pregnancy. She'd let him attend the doctor's appointments. She'd let him place his hand on her belly and feel their child move. She'd let him apologise day after day for the months of distance and doubt. He'd spent those months before the birth understanding the magnitude of what he'd nearly lost, understanding that his wife's strength had been tested almost to the breaking point, understanding that forgiveness, when it came, was a gift far greater than he deserved. The labour had been long, but not complicated. Beatrice had given birth to a son on a morning in spring, with Julian holding her hand throughout, whispering apologies and reassurances and declarations of love. The midwife had placed the child in his arms, and Julian had looked down at his son, healthy, strong, beautiful, and had felt something break open inside him, a healing, a redemption he hadn't dared to hope for. "His eyes," the midwife had said. "Look at those eyes." Julian had looked, and he'd seen with absolute certainty his own blue-grey eyes staring back at him, the same uncommon shade that had marked the Ashworth family for generations. No doubt, no question, no hesitation. He'd wept then, not from fear or shame or doubt, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that his wife had spoken the truth, and that his son carried the unmistakable mark of his own blood. They'd named the boy Edward, after Beatrice's grandfather, and he'd been presented to the world as the undisputed heir to the earldom. The scandal had faded as quickly as it had erupted. Society had moved on to new gossip. The county families had continued on as though nothing had happened. Within a year, people had nearly forgotten that there had ever been any question about Edward's paternity. But Julian and Beatrice had not forgotten. The experience had marked them both. It had nearly destroyed them, and it had forced them to understand something profound, that truth, even when it arrives late, is more powerful than any lie, that forgiveness is not weakness, but strength, that a marriage worth saving is worth fighting for, even when the cost is the complete dissolution of pride. Julian became, in many ways, a different man after Edward's birth. He became a man who listened, a man who spoke his doubts rather than burying them, a man who trusted his wife not just as a partner in marriage, but as an equal in truth and understanding. And Beatrice, who had endured the impossible accusations with quiet dignity, had learned that her own strength was unshakable, that she could love a man who'd hurt her, that she could forgive without losing herself. When Edward was 3 years old, Julian had taken him to the Cotswolds stream where his accident had occurred, and he'd told the boy the story, not all of it, but enough for him to understand that sometimes the most important strength wasn't in being perfect, but in learning to see and accept the truth. Edward had inherited his father's blue-grey eyes and his mother's steady strength. He would inherit the earldom, and he would know from the time he was old enough to understand that his existence had been built on the foundation of his parents' hard-won forgiveness and renewed trust. The scandal had nearly destroyed them. Instead, it had made them real.